Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Perfect Building Maintenance, M&T Bank, Customers Bank, Marks Paneth LLP, Ariel Property Advisors, Sterling National Bank, Capital One Bank, Collins Building Services, Meridian Capital Group. Additional support has been provided by grants from AVR Realty Company, Amerant Bank, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, B6 Real Estate Advisors, Briarwood Organization, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Chase Commercial Mortgage, Citizens Bank, CPEX Real Estate Services, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Flushing Bank, Friedman LLP, Handler Properties LLC, Handler Real Estate, Hodges Ward Elliott INC, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Matone Group, New Banks, Newmark Knight Frank, Optimum Window Manufacturing Corp., People's United Bank, Rockefeller Group, Rosewood Realty Services, SJP Properties, Stonehenge NYC, TD Bank, Terra CRG, the Meringor Family Foundation, and these friends. I've done a number of interesting life stories, but I'm telling you, I'm not even going to start on telling you about it. But I have Tom Cornish, who is the COO of Bank United, to tell his life story. So tell me about your German and Greek initial parents.
So I was born in Milwaukee, which is, has a long history of German immigration. At the turn of the century, there were actually 3 German newspapers in Milwaukee, and I was originally born to a Greek father and a German mother in 1958. I just celebrated my 60th birthday not that long ago. I never knew either of the two of them because I had we had a brother and a sister, both older than I was, and unfortunately one day in January of 1960, they chose to abandon us.
You were, what, 2.5 at this
I was 2.5.
What happens next?
So they leave us in an apartment building that they lived in the Brewer Hill district of Milwaukee, which is
known for the breweries.
So named because all the breweries are there and all the factories, and it was a working class neighborhood. So they left us in the apartment.
How old were the 2 other siblings?
1 and 2 years older than I. So the super and his wife, he worked for the Milwaukee Railroad, and she helped take care of the building. They naturally called, the officials, so to speak, and we were taken into custody of the state, and we were placed in the foster care program.
So you were in a foster home or in this building?
I was in a foster home.
Okay,
it was
so,
a facility.
So the 3 of you go to a foster home?
Correct.
Okay, then the superintendent, the former guy working on the railroad, and his wife want to plan to adopt you, correct?
That's correct. So they had not been able to have children themselves. For whatever reason, of the 3 of us, they seemed to like me the best. I don't know why.
You were the youngest?
I was the youngest, perhaps. Maybe I was the cutest, who knows?
Right, maybe the least rambunctious.
Could be. Maybe that wasn't proven to be true later. So they applied to get temporary custody of me and work through an adoption process with the state of Wisconsin.
While you're still living at the foster home?
They actually took physical custody of me at that point. They were given temporary custody.
So when is that? When you're
that's probably 1961.
Okay, so it's 3 years of age, and then your future foster father,
hopeful to be foster father,
right, passes on with a heart attack, correct?
Passes away suddenly of a heart attack, correct. And leaves my mom with just a small life insurance policy that he had at the Milwaukee Railroad, and basically no real way to support herself. And now she's in her late 30s, suffering from early stage arthritis. Unfortunately, she did not have much of an education. She didn't complete high school. And when she had to inform the authorities of this, they, promptly, let her know that given that she was now a single mom, talking 1961, no education, no ability to really support herself,
You'd have to go back to
that I'd have to go back to the foster care program. So that happened on whatever day it happened on. And the next day, we packed up our bags, and we were on a Greyhound bus, and off the two of us went.
So this is 1961. On the Greyhound bus, you go to about 4 or 5 different cities. Where do you start?
So we start a little odyssey through the center of the country, and we go from Milwaukee down to Indianapolis. We live in Indianapolis for a little while. Some of it's fuzzy in my mind exactly how long we spent in each individual place, but we went to Indianapolis. From Indianapolis, we did a brief stop in Kansas City, always in search of work for her. Work in warmer weather, given her arthritis, condition that was coming on. So then we moved our way to Oklahoma City, which is where we spent the most time. Then on to Dallas.
Oklahoma City, is that the place where we have the picture of you and the briefcase?
And the famous briefcase.
Talk to me about the briefcase.
So different people fall in love with different, objects for whatever reason that they happen to do so. And I've always been known as a briefcase lover. I enjoy the crafting of briefcases and the physicality of how the case is built and the styling and the colors. And I always like to have cases that match the shoes and clothes and whatnot.
You're 5 years of age, you're traveling all over, you're in Oklahoma City.
So I'm in a store in Oklahoma City, and I see this briefcase, beautiful briefcase, leather, kind of a tan colored briefcase. And I walked over. I can still remember doing it at that age, looking at the briefcase, opening it up, and just admiring how beautiful the briefcase was. So my mother, who was with me at the time, I think she had a Polaroid camera, and she took a picture of me with the briefcase. And so I'm sitting there with my jacket on, 5 years old, very proudly. I didn't buy this briefcase, obviously, but I'm sitting next to it.
So Oklahoma City, what type of jobs did your mother do in those different cities?
Always the same. She either worked in a hotel as a housekeeper, or she worked in a sort of a fast service restaurant as a waitress. That was how she supported us for virtually all the years that we lived together until I was a late teenager.
So Oklahoma City, then next stop is where?
Dallas. We arrived in Dallas a couple of years after the assassination of President Kennedy in Dallas. I remember people still talking about it when I was there. We spent probably 6 months in Dallas. She looked for work. We couldn't find anything. Now, I'm very young at the time. I'm 7 years old, so my ability to absorb everything that was happening around me.
And from Dallas, you go to Indian River, Florida?
Dallas, we moved to Miami. She had a sister who lived in Palm Beach County. We went to Miami. She didn't have a particularly great relationship with her sister, but at least it was a person who lived in the...
So when do you arrive in Miami?
1966. So I remember very well because that was the Dolphins' first season.
Right.
And I arrived almost the same time that they played Oakland for their very first game. I remember watching that game and seeing it on a small television.
Now, you said to me when we got together, sustenance in growing up was predicated on the tips that your mother made at the hotel or the restaurant, okay? And that would change that if you could have soup, or if you were lucky that the tips were good, she was able to have chicken or a variety of things. What happens, you're about 11, when you wake up and you say poverty is terrible because you've been thrown out of many houses? I mean, one time you were behind you were residing in a back of a TV store?
Correct. So I think most people who grow up in that kind of an atmosphere go through a period of time that when you're very young, you're not able to really process your environment. It seems normal, and you don't really have a knowledge base that anybody else really lives any differently. than you. It's not a social media environment, obviously, in the 1960s and early 1970s. And I think I can remember one day, 11 and a half, sort of it suddenly hit me that we lived in deep poverty. And we were, moving from place to place. Our lights were turned off every other month. I had to study with a flashlight. We lived in very, very small accommodations, usually a studio type apartment, fighting for food every day. And the story about the tips is at a very young age, I learned the economics of the hotel business when you're a housekeeper, because you know who's going to check out of what day. And I would actually make a list for her of the room she had and who was going to check out and what kind of tip we were hoping to get that day. So she would come home in the evening, she would lay out the tips, and based upon that, we would buy food the next day.
You were delivering newspapers yourself to help.
I had a newspaper route. I stood in front of a street called 54th Street and Northeast 2nd Avenue in Miami, and I had a little newspaper route for the Miami News, which is now defunct, but at one time it was the second newspaper in Miami.
So what happens at 11, besides the fact that you realize that you're living in deep poverty and you get angry, right?
Sure. You become angry at your environment and you start to comprehend, where you are in life, and you're living in a neighborhood where there was a lot of violence in my neighborhood. Crime rate was very high. You're living among other people who are in a similar situation as you are, and you start to recognize that the rest of the world doesn't live like this. And it leads
and you become a little rambunctious.
It leads to being rambunctious, which is why I mentioned I got more rambunctious at a later age as I started to become frustrated by the environment that I was in. And then as I developed as a teenager, it got worse and worse.
So you were expelled from high school 16 or 18 times?
Actually in the middle, Michael, 17.
Oh, I was close.
You were close. You had the bookends.
Okay, so you expelled 17 times in high school.
From two separate high schools, to be fair.
And what happens one day? There was a discussion about Earl Monroe. This was the pinnacle.
This was the pinnacle, yes. So I got into basketball was big in my school, and I got into a very serious argument with another student over whether Clyde Frazier was a better basketball player than Earl the Pearl Monroe. And somehow, as can happen in these types of environments, it escalated into a fight, and I ended up, unfortunately, throwing him out of a window.
The third floor of a window.
The third floor of a window at school, and that was my last opportunity to attend that school. At that one, I was permanently asked to leave, and fortunately, he wasn't hurt that badly, and I avoided any more serious problems with law enforcement officials over that. But
so you're 15 years of age at this time.
I'm 15.
This happened. What do you do now?
So I dropped out of school at 15. By now, I'm completely angry at the world. I'm hostile. I'm involved in all kinds of activities that are not good activities, petty crime, all sorts of things. And I decide to leave school. And I don't do anything. I hang out. I play basketball. I shoot pool. I run around with groups of other kids that are up to no good. Don't do any work at all. I'm angry and hostile at the world and not seeing where life is going to go for me.
So one day you're near the highway, right? What happens?
One day I'm sitting under the expressway. And as I always say, in any city in America, nothing good happens under the expressway. I'm sitting under the expressway in Liberty City in Miami. And I'm watching a bunch of other guys, do drugs and things of this nature. And a vision came back to me, a moment came back to me that changed my life at that moment. And I recalled before I left school, I had an English teacher, and the English teacher would make everyone get up and read. She would require you to stand up and read aloud. So in my school, virtually no one could read more than 2 or 3 sentences without stumbling very badly over the reading. I was always a very good reader. For whatever reason, I took an interest in reading as a child, and maybe it was my kind of escape from the environment that I was in, but reading mystery books was my thing as a young kid. So I stood up and I read a full page perfectly without any stumbling or anything. And I sat down, and class was dismissed, and as I was walking out, she reached over and she grabbed me by the elbow. And she said, Thomas, I think not many people call me Thomas, but she said, Thomas, I have a question to ask you. I'm familiar with your academic record here and all the problems that you've had. I've just watched you read, so I only have one question for you. And that question is, why are you so determined to waste your own life? And at that moment, I didn't respond. So it hits me right at that moment, bang, like a lightning bolt coming out of the sky. I look at these guys in front of me. I remember that comment about why are you so determined to waste your life? And suddenly it hit me, that's exactly what I was doing. That I had, intelligence, I had other positive things about me, and I was wasting my life. So I walked down the ramp, crossed town, walked about 10 blocks to where you could take the public bus, and I went to the Adult Education Center, which was part of Dade County Public Schools in Miami, and I enrolled in a classroom setting GED program. And I went there for about a year and a half, every day, and I got a job working.
As the usher in the movie theater?
As an usher in a movie theater, which was a great job to have for that. And I would take the bus every evening to Miami Beach, and I worked in a theater in Miami Beach as an usher. I fibbed about my age. You had to be 18, but I was large enough that I could pass for 18, and then I would go for my GED studies in the daytime, and it was a good environment because it was actually a classroom setting,
right,
versus just learning online or something like that.
So you get your GED, and then you enroll in community college.
And I enrolled in Miami-Dade Community College. Didn't really have any idea where I was going to go with that.
Right, and at that time, you still had the usher job, but you also had the job at the International House of Pancakes,
right.
Burger King, and a couple of other...
Right, so I left my career as an usher, and I worked at, because the hours were better, to work the graveyard shift at IHOP as a busboy. So I worked my way through both Miami-Dade Community College and Florida International University.
Let's talk about Florida International because it has many effects on your future life. So you finished Miami-Dade.
I enroll in FIU, and I'm working now. I'm continuing to work as a busboy, and I'm also working as a security guard on the midnight shift in a condominium in Bal Harbor.
Right, and you also were working in stock in toys.
I was a seasonal stock boy in the toy department at Jefferson's department store, which is no longer with us.
So when do you graduate FIU?
1985.
So it's 1985. You're 27 years of age at this time, and you really don't know what you want to do. So you walk up Brickell Boulevard to the banks?
So I decided at this point that, I had enough educational background that I could do something else. So I graduate, I go out and I buy an extremely awful suit from JCPenney, and I put on a suit, I make up my own resumes. I go down to Brickell Avenue in Miami where all the banks were. I didn't know one bank from another, but banking was a big industry in Miami, and it seemed a lot better than working at IHOP and as a security guard. And I walked up and down Brickell Avenue and went to every single bank and every single human resources department. So the bank that I went to was a bank called Flagship National Bank. And Flagship National Bank made me the only offer that anybody made me, which was to join their accounting department as an accounts payable clerk. So I accepted that offer at $11,000 a year, and I joined Flagship National Bank. Flagship then subsequently sold to Sun Bank. Sun Bank subsequently sold to Trust Company of Georgia, which became SunTrust.
So from the accounting department, how do you get into the training program?
Luck, as many times things happen in life. So they had a nascent training program that was fairly small and not as structured as most training programs ultimately became in banking. Someone left. They had an opening for one person as a credit analyst trainee. It didn't make any sense to go back out into a college recruiting program to try to find one person. So the job was posted internally in the organization. I saw the posting and decided that I was going to try to get into the management training program, credit training program. I went down and applied, and somebody liked me and thought I could do it.
So let's talk about your 20-year career over there before you changed roles in the C-suite. You were in a variety of roles. You were involved with international banking, real estate banking. Now, you said to me you never had a passport when you got involved with the international division.
I didn't. So I started off my career after I left the credit training program as sort of a baseline business banker, banking, local companies kind of in the $5 to $20 million sales range. And fortunately, I did well. And I was at this regional manager level for the group, running both the commercial and retail side of a group of branches at a time when there was a resurgence of the economies of Latin America. Miami's obviously very closely tied to trade finance and business in Latin America. The bank had a fairly small presence in the international world, mostly because by the time all of these mergers were done, the original flagship bank, which was the foundation of the bank in Miami, had been a very active player in Latin America in the 1980s. And when Mexico defaulted and the rest of the Latin American contagion happened after that, the bank lost a lot of money in Latin America. So no one was really that keen on the idea of going back into Latin America. But economies start to improve, banks start to re-enter the market, and I saw what I thought was an opportunity to try to build a trade finance business for SunTrust at the time. So I went to the fellow who was the president of the bank at that time and volunteered for the job. And so that was kind of an interesting conversation because I think I was 31 at the time. I had a good background on the lending side. But he said to me, he said, "Have you ever worked in international banking?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Do you know, have you ever been to Latin America?" And I said, "No." And he scratched his head and he said, "Do you even have a passport?" And I said, "No." And he said, "So let me get this straight. You expect me to take a 31-year-old kid without a passport who's never traveled to Latin America and who's never worked in international banking."
And who can't speak Spanish?
I spoke Spanish.
Oh, you did?
That was my, sometimes things in life that you do end up playing a role for other reasons that you don't think they're going to play a reason.
Those group of kids that you used to play with.
And I took a liking to Spanish, and I decided to pick up a Berlitz book when I was 17 and 18 and learn how to speak Spanish. In Miami, once you get going, it's fairly easy to find people to speak to.
You spend approximately 21 years and you progressed your final job at?
I was head of wholesale banking for South Florida and president of the Miami Bank.
So at 44, you meet a guy when you were at the bank.
So I happened to meet this gentleman because he was very involved in the Jewish Federation in Broward County. And he asked me when I was at the bank if we would consider supporting the organization. I went out with him, got to know the organization a little bit, and we ultimately did support it. And it started a friendship between he and I. So, one day he called me and said, "Listen, I've kind of reached a point in my life where I don't want to do this business every day. I've been in it for 45 years. I'd like to kind of move on and do other things, but I don't really have anybody to turn it over to. Would you be even remotely interested in talking about coming over and buying stock and being my partner, and the two of us, kind of running this business, you every day and me in a much lighter fashion?"
Subsequently, you become president of that company, correct?
I joined as president and CEO.
Right. And then the insurance agency is sold to Marsh Mac.
Well, Marsh & McLennan in New York.
Then how do you meet with Bank United, where you're presently the COO?
Another moment of luck. So we sold our company in 2011, but in 2009, before the sale, I happened to be sitting in my office one day and I was called by an old friend who was a senior executive at SunTrust during my time there, who had gone to Bank United prior to the bank failing and being taken over by the FDIC, stayed there through that and stayed on after John Canis and the private equity group came in and recapitalized it and bought it out of the receivership. So this fellow called me and he said, "Listen, this John's coming into town in a couple of days. They've just bought the bank. He doesn't really know anybody in Miami that well, and I'm putting together a lunch tomorrow, so on short notice, for about 15 people in the business community in Miami to meet John, but mostly to talk to him about what you see in this marketplace.
Right. So subsequently, you get involved with Bank United, and then you're made COO.
I joined the bank in 2014 as the president of Florida. In 2016, we go through sort of a management transition where John retired from the bank. Raj Singh, who was the COO of the bank, became the CEO, and then I transitioned to the COO role.
I want to bring out, you met your wife.
So we originally met at SunTrust. Then she left and went into the insurance business.
Right. You have 3 children.
I have 3 children, Karina, Christopher, who is 27, and then my youngest son, Nicholas, who's 15.
You were the chairman of the board of trustees of Florida International.
I was the chairman of the foundation board of FIU. I chaired the board of Miami Children's Hospital Foundation for 5 years. And I chaired the Beacon Council, which is the economic development agency for Miami-Dade County.
And why do you want to give back now so much?
I have so much to pay back. You know, I think I'm a talented person, but so many things in my life could have gone differently. So many people had a dramatic impact on me and kind of have helped me become who I am, and I think it's incredibly important to support the growth of other people.
And I think the most important person, besides your mother, who was always there for you, is that school teacher who reminded you, don't screw up your life. You have more to accomplish. And thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it.
Major funding for these broadcasts has been provided by grants from New York Community Bank, AmTrust Title Insurance Company, Perfect Building Maintenance, M&T Bank, Customers Bank, Marks Paneth LLP, Ariel Property Advisors, Sterling National Bank, Capital One Bank, Collins Building Services, Meridian Capital Group. Additional support has been provided by grants from AVR Realty Company, Amarant Bank, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, B6 Real Estate Advisors, Briarwood Organization,